Hey folks, great to be with you again. Here we are starting the final book of the Torah, Sefer Devarim, book of Deuteronomy. And on the face of it, it seems like a chapter, like a section where there's not much to talk about, because it's a lot of journeys and a lot of recounting of the story by Moses as he begins his long narration that will last all the way through the book until the very end. But when you look at it again, there is much to say here, because Parashat Devarim is really, I think, the beginning of what we can call Judaism. You might say, no, we're still in the biblical period. Judaism is a post-biblical phenomenon. It's rabbinic. But the processes that lead to Judaism already make their first appearance here. And I say that about the two great portions of Jewish literature, of Jewish thinking, Agadah and Halacha. These are the words Moses spoke. He begins to tell the story of what happened, where we are, where we're going. Very interestingly, he doesn't start the story in Egypt, certainly not with the ancestors, but not in Egypt either. The story begins at Sinai when God said, "Get off your butts and get moving, pnu su'ulachem." Get going on your journey. If you remember last week's conversation about two types of journeys, the journey from and the journey to, this is the beginning of the journey to. Turn and go toward the land which I promised you. He's speaking to the new generation. The new generation doesn't remember Egypt. They have no Egypt in their background. Remember, everybody who was in Egypt, except for Caleb, Joshua, and Moses, has died out. So this is an entirely new generation. So he's saying to them, this is now your story. And he's going to tell the story differently because he wants to make it relevant to this new generation. And that's exactly what Agadah is, narrative. The constant retelling of the story to keep the story alive and fresh and relevant to the new generation. He has to do that. And he has a right to do that. Even an obligation to, because if you just tell them the old story over and over again, they're not going to listen. And so he embellishes, so he changes, but he begins it with them. He begins it with the task of their generation. That's what God told me about. It's not that God gave me the Torah even. It's God said, tell them to get up and go. Now, this process of retelling the story for the new generation, that process is the process of Judaism. Judaism is the telling of a story. What do? We pass it down from generation to generation. Masoret means passing on. Tradition means handing over, passing on. The most obvious example of it is Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim at the Seder. What do? The mitzvah is V'yigadat levincha, tell your child. And we're supposed to tell it to them in a way they understand and will relate to. Just mumbling through the Haggadah is not fulfilling that mitzvah very well. Because you have to, V'yigadat as a mitzvah of communication. But as you communicate it, you're going to tell it differently. You're going to tell it so that generation, so the representative of that generation in your family can come to appreciate it. And that's how Judaism grows. That's how Agadah grows. The whole narrative that becomes Jewish thought grows out of that process. Most theology, Jewish theology, is mostly narrative theology. It's a theology that emerges out of the stories. What did God promise Abraham? What did Jacob see? What did the Israelites experience when they tasted the man? The theology grows out of the narrative. Only in the Middle Ages, in Maimonides, for example, do we have an abstract theology that doesn't start with narrative, but that's ultimately alien to Judaism. And such attempts at systematic theology that are not related to narrative do not survive in the long run in Judaism. What survives is the story and insights from the story. That's why I spend all my time with Hasidic sources that are commentaries on the Torah, because the real insights of Judaism begin with the narrative, begin with the constant retelling of the story. So that's the Agadah. Now, on the halachic side, it's also true that Judaism may be said to begin here, because in Sefer Devarim, Moses is going to say things that he hadn't said before, even give laws that weren't there before, say things in different ways. Take, for example, first the law of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year in the book of Leviticus is all about agriculture. It's all about letting the land rest every 7 years. In Devarim, it's going to be all about loans. It's going to be all about forgiving loans every 7 years, and to what extent you can and can't, and what you do about it. You might say, if you're a good Marxist, because the means of production have shifted from agriculture to commerce. But that would mean it was written at a different time. Well, let's say this is a different version of Moses. What can I tell you? But there's a definite change. So therefore, somebody has to come along and rectify this change and decide what the law really is. Or new laws like shatnez, of not mixing linen and woolen garments, or the bird's nest, what you do if you find a bird's nest with eggs, or building a railing along your roof so people won't fall off. All those things occur for the first time in Devarim. They were never there, so there's an addition. There's an addition of halachot. Then there are things that have changed in another way. There's seasons of the year, and the sacrifices for them are talked about several places in Shmot and in Vayikra and in Bamidbar. But here we have suddenly a new element. B'makom asher yivchar. You may offer sacrifices only in the place which God chooses, which is to say, some vision of a united cult, only in Yerushalayim, only on Har HaBayit, only on the Holy Mountain can sacrifices be offered, not outside the temple. That's new. Well, why is that there in Devarim? Moshe is saying this in his old age. Why didn't he say it earlier? If you're an insider to that, that's what you ask. And therefore, how do we resolve all these things? Well, for that, we have a verse here. For all of that, we have a verse here for Agadah and the Halacha. We have a verse that says, Ho'il Moshe be'er et haTorah hazot. Moses was willing to interpret the Torah. But all the commentators read it as Ho'il Moshe be'er et haTorah hazot. Moses turned the Torah into a well. And of a well, you have a spring underneath, and you can therefore always get fresh water. You can get something new. You can renew the story, but you could also renew the halachic process. The halachic process, however, has to be decided by judges, by shoftim. And here we have a new version at the beginning of Devarim of how those judges were selected. It's not related to Jethro, as in Exodus 18, where Yitro advises Moshe to appoint judges, because remember, you will wear out if you judge everything yourself, and he appoints them over thousands and hundreds and so on. Here the story goes back rather to Parashat Bahalotcha, when Moses says, "How can I bear the burden of this people alone?" Here, those almost those very words are repeated in this first chapter of Devarim. Echa salavadi, how can I bear them alone? So God gives him 70 elders. We met those 70 elders in Shmot, yes, in the end of Parashat Mishpatim, the vision on the mountain. We met those elders in Bahalotcha, but there those elders were given V'atzalti min haruach, they were given a spiritual gift. And it was because of that spiritual gift participating in Moses' revelation. V'atzalti min haruach. Asher alecha, the same spirit you have, Moses, I'm going to give to them, that they became able to declare what the law was. Here, as it's repeated in Deuteronomy, it's a rational process. Find yourselves chachamim, nevonim, v'yodim. Find yourselves wise and thoughtful and aware people who can make these judgments. It's not about a spiritual discovery. What is the halachic process over the generations? Is it rational discussion of the law and the best argument wins? It seems to have been decided that way in a famous story of the Talmud called the Oven of Achnai. But later generations didn't see it that way. They saw it as an ongoing process of atzilut. God reveals God's self in the words of the sages, then in the words of the tzaddikim. Because Shechina medaberet mitoch grono, the Shechina speaks out of his throat. And therefore the words the Rebbe says, the words that Tzaddik says, and sometimes the words the sage say are really ongoing divine speech, because revelation has never ended. So that big question in Judaism about what the halachic process is it an essentially secular process of rational judgment, or through that rational judgment does something of revelation of divine will happen? That's an open question that exists through the history of Judaism. So all of that begins, I'm suggesting, Agadah and Halacha, with this Parashat Devarim, and the process that is going to, over the centuries, become Yahadut, become Judaism. By the way, that word Yahadut does not exist, meaning Judaism, until the 18th century. It's a new word. It's a modern word. They would have said the process of Torah. Torah is an ongoing process of discovery, revelation. That's the question. Shabbat Shalom. Great to be with you. See you next week.